Chapter 5: The Mission of the Reich. Nations often maintain elite troops to supplement regular military forces. They serve as personal bodyguards for the ruler, perform ceremonial functions, and in wartime deploy where the fighting is the hardest. From the Persian immortals and Roman praetorians of the ancient world throughout the ages, elite formations uphold traditions of prowess in combat and loyalty. During World War II, France's Chasseurs Alpins, British Royal Marines, Soviet Guard divisions, and the U.S. Marine Corps were among units retaining this select status. In addition to the prestigious Army divisions, Brandenburg, Feldernau, and Grossdeutschland, as well as the airborne, Germany fielded an entire service branch of elite ground forces, the Waffen-SS. It evolved from 4 pre-war internal security regiments into a dauntless and respected frontline troop. It challenged official German policy and dogma and helped introduce significant amendments. Considering the obedience to state authority customarily drilled into military establishments, this was an unusual wellspring for political and social reform. The maturation of Waffen-SS demonstrates how National Socialism's emphasis on personal initiative created the opportunity for flexibility and development on an unprecedented scale. The SS traces its origin to the early years of the NSDAP. Fewer than 100 men formed the Adolf Hitler shock troop in Munich in 1923. This was a personal bodyguard recruited by SA men displaying personal loyalty to the Führer. Its members generally possessed better comprehension of the movement's political objectives than the rank-and-file SA. The troop received its final name, the Security Echelon, in April 1925. It maintained strict discipline and a small selective affiliation. Heinrich Himmler became chief of the SS in January 1929 and proved a talented organizer and a match for political rivals in the party. Once Hitler gained power in 1933, Himmler sought to enroll affluent persons such as successful businessmen and aristocrats to enhance the organization's prestige. Private contributions through a public sponsorship program helped finance the administration. The SS grew from 280 members in 1929 to 52,000 by 1933. National security issues led to the formation of an SS military branch. When Hitler became chancellor, communists were still numerous in Germany. They hijacked 150 tons of explosives, of which just 15 tons had been recovered by the police by mid-March 1933. The exiled communist Wilhelm Peich issued a proclamation in September calling for a general strike and armed insurrection by the majority of the German proletariat to topple the Hitler dictatorship. The police were neither equipped nor trained to suppress a possible uprising. The German army was not psychologically suited to wage urban warfare against elements of the indigenous population. After discussions with War Minister Werner von Blomberg, Hitler decided that the task of combating potential civil unrest should fall to a party formation. Blomberg's decree of September 24, 1934 defined its purpose as for special internal political missions assigned by the Führer to the SS. This was the birth of the Waffen-SS, officially titled VT, an abbreviation, from 1935 to 1940, the expression translating literally as availability troop, meaning ready for immediate deployment. Hitler himself stated, "The SS VT is neither a part of the armed forces nor of the police. It is a standing armed troop available exclusively for my use." The VT consisted of Hitler's Berlin-based bodyguard, which performed primarily ceremonial functions, the Deutschland Regiment garrisoned in Munich, Germania and Hamburg, plus an engineer battalion in Dresden and a signals battalion in Berlin. A 4th Motorized Infantry Regiment, der Führer, mustered in Vienna in 1938. With army approval, the SS established a military academy to train VT officers at Bad Tolz in October 1934. General Paul Hauser, who had retired from the army in 1932, received a commission to found a second school in Brunswick. Each institution offered a 10-month curriculum to commission officers. The VT soldiers' pay was the same as that of the regular army. Adding an artillery regiment as well as anti-aircraft tank, anti-tank, and reconnaissance battalions, the VT numbered 18,000 men by May 1939. Though the Army assisted in instruction, the VT's training departed from military convention. Its senior commanders had been junior officers during World War I. They witnessed how battles of material had decimated the Army's long-standing cadre of well-schooled professional officers, non-commissioned officers, and reservists. The Quality of personnel declined as hastily trained replacements filled the void. The general staff failed to break the deadlock of trench warfare. Frontline regiments began forming small independent units called shock troops. They retrained behind the lines to fight in close coordination using flamethrowers, smoke canisters, machine guns, pistols, and grenades. Officers displayed boldness and initiative, directly leading their men into combat. The commander of the Deutschland Regiment, Felix Steiner, wrote that during World War I, the officers assembled the best, most experienced soldiers the front could spare. They realized the shock troop concept of spontaneity, rapid assault, and the mechanics of the little troops trade within the framework of entire formations. They were of different spirit than the mobilized masses. In a world of standardization of soldiering, they proved that better trained, hand-picked soldiers mastering the military technology of the times were a match for any vastly superior collective soldierly mass. After World War I, the German General Staff reverted to the pre-war concept of a disciplined professional army without particular emphasis on improvisation. Though the army still trained officers at lower command levels to take initiative and be decisive in battle, the program did not include forming shock troops. Steiner exploited the comparative independence of the VT to develop a contemporary fighting force less constrained by customary military regimen. Not the form of Prussian drill still in part practiced in the army, but training and educating men to become modern individual fighters was the goal, wrote the former SS captain Fritz Schroeder. Though Steiner acknowledged that mass armies are indispensable elements of total war, he considered rapidly mobile elite formations distributed among the army decisive in order to disperse the enemy through lightning-fast blows and destroy the scattered units. In the words of one historian, the training program Steiner introduced to the Deutschland Regiment broke the preeminence of mechanical barracks drill. Physical education also played a significant role in the VT. It promoted the soldier-athlete concept, competitive sports supplanted calisthenics, and forced marches as the focus of the training. Enlisted personnel competed against their officers and NCOs in sports contests. The purpose was not just to weld leader and follower into a cohesive fighting unit. It also taught officers to rely on their ability to command and strength of character to gain the confidence and respect of men, rather than on the customary aloofness and strict discipline of military protocol. In the same spirit, the VT dropped the practice of soldiers addressing officers as sir, or speaking in the third person. Through such steps, the relationship between the leadership and men became much more personal and ultimately more binding. Officers and men dined together in the same mess hall. Pastor Karl Ozenkopf, a former Army captain transferred to the Waffen-SS, recalled, "Contrary to the Army, disparity in rank was no barrier dividing person from person. There was no pedantic structure held together by fear of punishment. This did not lead to a lack of discipline, but to a voluntary discipline such as I have seldom experienced. In this corps, one felt completely free." A former director of the Tolles Academy summarized, "The authority of the officers, who were scarcely older than the men, rested far more on esteem for their character, performance, and care for the men's welfare." A soldier in the Germania Regiment in 1937 and future officer Heinrich Springer wrote this of Flirz's first platoon commander. "He was not just a military instructor, but guided us, cultivating a decent personal bearing, inwardly and outwardly perceptible. Throughout the entire time as a recruit, I never once heard him shout at or curse the men." The former General Staff Officer Hauser patterned the instruction at the Brunswick Academy to be similar to Army institutions. The two SS schools for young gentlemen assigned top priority to preparing candidates for field operations and tactical combat command. Instructors also placed emphasis on personality development. As Lieutenant Colonel Richard Schultz wrote, "The Junker School's goal was to produce men of refined, fearless character, chivalrous with an unblemished sense of honor and obedience, displaying helpfulness, camaraderie, and willingness to accept responsibility. Impeccable deportment in public and cultivation of family values were also prerequisites." The staff encouraged cadets to exhibit a respectful but never subservient demeanor towards superiors. The VT educated field officers to exercise audacity as well as initiative. The Junker schools did not select candidates from among the General SS, but from enlisted members of the VT. Only men who had already served in the ranks could receive an appointment to Bad Tolz or to Brunswick. In the German army, a university degree was sufficient for an applicant to be accepted into a war college. Education had no influence on VT standards for enrollment. Many Junker School cadets did not possess a high school diploma. the institutions nonetheless graduated capable officers. The English historian Gerald Reitlinger concluded, under the influence of Hauser's cadet schools, the Waffen-SS developed the most efficient of all military training systems of the Second World War. George Gestat, who had belonged to the 12th SS Panzer Division in 1944, wrote this of the men he served under. We had fantastic superior officers, from platoon leaders to the battalion commanders and upward, who were genuine ideals for the men. Looking back, I can objectively state that during the Normandy operation, amid all the inferno and terror, I never saw a superior officer suffer a breakdown or lose his nerve. Again and again, when things looked so hopeless and critical, they mastered the situation calmly and with presence of mind. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the VT fell under Armed Forces Command. The OKW distributed most VT formations among army divisions participating in the campaign. The SS soldiers acquitted themselves well in battle and expansion, and reorganized as the VT followed. Hauser formed Deutschland, Germany, Der Fuhrer, and the combat support units into a single division in October 1939. That same month, the SS transferred 15,000 law enforcement personnel to create the SS Police Division. Yet another new division, Death's Head, filled its roster largely from concentration camp guards and incorporated the Home Guard Danzig. Together with Hitler's bodyguard, the military branch of the SS now numbered 100,000. The entire force deployed in the 1940 campaign against Holland, Belgium, and France, fighting side by side with the regular army. The SS had accomplished the expansion of the VT, renamed the Waffen-SS in 1940, by shifting men from other contingents under Himmler's command. This was necessary because the OKW, which had jurisdiction over the draft, limited the number of indigenous recruits whom the Waffen-SS could induct. In order to increase its quantity of divisions, the chief of SS recruitment, Gottlob Berger, developed a fresh source of manpower. He introduced a campaign to encourage enlistment from among the expansive ethnic German colonies in southeastern Europe. In May 1939, 1,080 members of Romania's German community left the country to join the Waffen-SS. They preferred to avoid service in the Romanian army, whose officers treated ethnic German recruits badly. During the war, the roster of ethnic Germans from beyond the Reich's frontiers who served in the Waffen-SS would greatly increase. Over 60,000 of them came from Romania alone. In time, Berger's solution for increasing manpower would significantly redefine the character of the Waffen-SS. A primary element determining the survival of a species is its ability to adapt to shifting environs. This natural law applies to nations as well. War forces abrupt changes that demand endurance and flexibility of disposition in order to rapidly accept new conditions. In Hitler's time, nationalism was a compelling influence. It aroused people to give for their country, but simultaneously maintained barriers between nations. On the threshold of World War II, Europe stood in the shadow of peripheral superpowers prepared to contest her leadership in world affairs. To assert her economic and political independence and preserve her cultural identity, her populations needed to evolve toward mutual cooperation and fellowship. Italy's former treasurer Alberto Di Stefani observed, "We're all persuaded that continuation of this intransigent nationalism, which has no understanding for the requirements of a continental policy, is finally turning Europe against herself." Europe settled into an uneasy peace in the summer of 1940 following a series of rapid campaigns Germany had conducted against neighboring states. German army garrisons held western Poland, Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Holland, Belgium, and northern France. Allied with Italy and favored by Spain, the Reich also enjoyed economic influence over the Balkans. Cooperation with Germany was necessary for a strong, unified continent. The continuing war against Britain required the German armed forces to occupy the North Atlantic coast to guard against potential British landings. The German military presence was not popular with the populations affected. The English also supported communist resistance movements in the occupied countries, encouraging sabotage. They trained and smuggled in agents, plus weapons and explosives, while the BBC broadcast anti-German wireless propaganda designed for Western Europe. At the same time, many Europeans regarded the Reich's victories as a demonstration of the authoritarian state's form's superiority. Democracy had not only failed to alleviate unemployment and depression for the past 20 years, but bungled national defense. Germany's spirited martial society aroused awe and to some extent admiration among her neighbors. The parliamentary debates, scandals, lack of progress, and uninspired leadership associated with democracy seemed vapid by comparison. Marxism had an equally unimpressive track record. Leon de Grelle, a Belgian who eventually served in the Waffen-SS, wrote that Marxism nowhere reached its promised goal of welfare for all. The broad masses considered it a complete failure during the 1930s. They sought the remedy in other mass movements, those that tried to realize the desired social objectives within the framework of order, authority, firm leadership, and devotion to fatherland. One blight on the track record of Western European governments, as far as the people in their charge were concerned, was the dismal military performance against Germany in 1940. In Norway, for example, the state had periodically slashed defense spending between the world wars. The army could no longer afford to conduct field exercises, officers and men received inadequate training, and there were no anti-tank weapons for the infantry. The Germans invaded Norway on April 9. The German Navy had urged Hitler to take this step in order to thwart a planned British amphibious operation to come ashore to sever the Reich's transit route importing strategic materials from Sweden and Finland via Norway. The German armed forces landed 100,000 men from ships and planes. The indecisive reaction of the Norwegian government and conflicting military orders plunged Norway's mobilization into chaos. Retreating Norwegian army units failed to uniformly destroy tunnels, bridges, or lines of communication to delay the enemy's advance. German motorized units refueled their vehicles at pumping stations the defenders had abandoned intact. Some Norwegian troops surrendered at first sight of the invaders. The capital fell without a shot fired. The German 324th Infantry Regiment landed at a nearby airfield and entered Oslo in marching order led by its brass band. The German armed forces simultaneously occupied Denmark. This was to secure lines of communication and supply to the strategic Norwegian theater of operations. The previous January, Thorvald Stauning, head of the country's social liberal government, had more or less admitted publicly that Denmark would be unable to defend her neutrality. He did nothing to improve defense capabilities. In the early morning of April 9, the German icebreaker Stettin and the troop transport the Hansestadt Danzig, ferrying 1,000 riflemen of 198th Infantry Division, steamed into Copenhagen harbor. Danish searchlights illuminated the ship's German war flag and the soldiers on deck. The coastal batteries, however, never fired. As one Danish lieutenant told a parliamentary commission after the war, the men on watch fumbled with the cannon but had no idea of what actually to do. The mechanism was out of order, so the breech didn't work. A crewman of another shore battery testified, "We didn't have a single man who would have been able to operate the cannon." The German troops landed unmolested and occupied the capital. The day before, the government had received a report that German forces were massing at Flensburg, a city near the Danish frontier. When the invasion began, the Stauning administration stated in a proclamation, "It is the people's duty to offer no resistance against these troops." It ordered the Danish army to stand down. This evoked bitterness among soldier and civilian alike. The public suspected that the government had sabotaged national defense in collusion with the Germans. One Dane recalled many young people had already been disappointed over political developments in Denmark for a long time. The political system the government represented finally lost our confidence. Holland, another constitutional monarchy, Germany invaded the following month. The Dutch parliament underfunded the military. Shortages of uniforms and small arms compelled recruits to wear a motley combination of army tunics and civilian caps, and often to substitute wooden staffs for rifles when standing posts. One Dutchman wrote, "Because of the general disinterest in the army also manifest among politicians, not a single cadet enrolled in the Imperial Military Academy during 1935 and 36. Dutch pacifists lobbied to have the army disbanded. The German armed forces required just 5 days to break its resistance. France, a pioneer of democracy, displayed weaknesses that one might attribute to the influence of liberalism's emphasis on the individual. Lieutenant Pierre Mendès-France observed this upon returning home from Syria only days before the Germans invaded his country on May 10, 1940. Everyone, civilians as well as those in the military, had but one thing on their minds: to arrange their personal affairs as well as possible to get through the seemingly endless period with little or no risk, loss, or discomfort. On May 18th, with the French army already reeling before the German offensive, General Gamelin wrote this to France's prime minister: "The German success is most of all the result of physical training and of the lofty moral attitude of the people. The French soldier, the private citizen of yesterday, never believed there would be war. Often his interests did not reach beyond his workbench, his office, or his farm. Inclined to habitually criticize anyone in authority, and demanding on the pretext of civilization the right to live a comfortable existence from day to day. Those capable of bearing arms never received the moral or patriotic upbringing between the two wars that would have prepared them for the drama that would decide the fate of their country. Inadequate defense preparations, craven leadership, and moral deficiency were not the only factors causing Western Europeans to lose confidence in the parliamentary system or in democracy. English conduct during the fighting left a bad impression. Retreating across Belgium and northern France toward Dunkirk, demolition parties of the British Expeditionary Force destroyed bridges, warehouses, refineries, fuel dumps, harbor installations, and anything else presumed potentially useful to the advancing German army. A Belgian sergeant described, for example, how on May 27th his men saw British troops destroying food stores. Worst of all was that refugees were there also, who had not eaten for days. They watched English soldiers throw eggs against the walls of houses, stomp on biscuits, and split tinned preserves with axes. Germany and France concluded an armistice on June 22, 1940. The agreement stated that German government does not intend to use the French battle fleet in wartime for its own purposes, acknowledging that the French need the warships to safeguard their interests in the colonial sphere. On July 3rd, a British Royal Navy squadron steamed from Gibraltar to the French-Algerian anchorage at Mers el-Kabir. The English demanded that the French battle fleet moored there join them to continue fighting Germany or scuttle the ships. When French Admiral Marcel Gensoul refused the ultimatum, the British bombarded his fleet. The battleship Bretagne sank. The Provence and the Dunkirk suffered serious damage, and the barrage cost 1,147 French sailors their lives. Royal Navy torpedo planes raided the harbor again on July 6, killing another 150 seamen. 2 days later, British naval forces attacked Dakar, damaging the French battleship the Richelieu. All this evoked strong anti-English sentiment throughout France. Britain extended her nautical blockade of foodstuffs to include European countries occupied by the German army, creating hardships for the populations. London established sham governments in exile for these states. They consisted of democracy, politicians, officials, and aristocrats who had deserted their country and fled to Britain, in most cases when the fighting was still going on. Entirely dependent on England for their existence, these administrations supposedly represented the true interests of Europe. The United States also sought to indirectly influence European affairs. On February 9, 1940, the U.S. State Department announced an economic plan for post-war Europe. According to Secretary of State Hull, America would support the principal European currencies through loans backed by gold. This would supposedly regenerate commerce once peace returned. It was apparent that Washington was intent on eradicating Germany's burgeoning international barter system and restoring trade based on gold as the medium of exchange. The State Department relied on the Council of American Bankers when preparing the plan, not consulting representatives of the continent it was intended for. Other resolutions and proposals for post-war reconstruction followed, such as the Atlantic Charter, the Keynes Plan, and the Morgenthau Plan, and economic conferences in Hot Springs in 1943 and in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in July 1944. The Bretton Woods session established the International Monetary Fund in order to influence and, if possible, regulate foreign economies after the war, bringing the world one step closer to Roosevelt's vision of a global government. In a speech in Königsberg on July 7, Walter Funk, the Reich's Minister of Economics, told European economists, "Today the Americans are propagating a return to the gold standard. What this means, especially considering this country's dominant hoard of gold, is nothing but an elevation of the dollar to the basis for currencies worldwide and a claim to absolute control of the world economy." A German diplomat pointed out the prerequisite for practical implementation of such plan is the conquest of Europe by the other side. German propaganda capitalized on the subjective character of these programs. A periodical targeting a broad-based European readership asked its January 1941 issue, "Will foreign powers and racially alien forces determine Europe's fate for all time to come, or will Europe form her own future through her own vitality and her own responsibility?" Another German publication stated, "One of the main deficiencies in the mentality of the American is that he has no clear comprehension of other peoples. For this reason, he shrugs off their rights and natural requirements for life with a wave of the hand. He claims the prerogative to dictate his boundless wishes to the rest of the world, thanks to an unrivaled sense of superiority. German leaders realized that to win European support, they would have to offer a viable alternative to the Anglo-American agenda. The most immediate requirement was to regulate the continental economy to become as self-sufficient and cooperative as possible. The British endeavored to starve or make destitute the populations of states under German occupation in order to lend impetus to resistance cells. Werner Dies, economic advisor in the NSDAP Foreign Policy Branch, submitted a memorandum in May 1940 urging establishment of a trade commission to explore Germany's options. The present blockade had unavoidably made necessary the formation of a continental European economy under German leadership as an economic self-help measure. If we expect to direct Europe's commerce, which is absolutely essential to economically strengthen the continent, that is the mainstay of the white race, then we must naturally not publicly declare this to be a Germanic economic sphere. We must always speak only of Europe. As the ranking industrial power, only Germany could organize a prosperous and independent continental economy. The September 1940 edition of the National Socialist Monthly stated, "Without the Reich, a European community of nations can never be established. The Reich is the great political mission of the German people. It represents the concept of a European order. It eliminates foreign influences and guards against powers hostile to Europe. It strives for European cooperation on the principle of ethnic kinship and of productive labor as the substance and foundation of life." One of Germany's more astute propagandists was Major Walter Gell, who served in the infantry in both world wars. He recognized that securing his country's influence depended not on military conquest, but on gaining the popular support of neighboring peoples. In The Mission of the Reich, he wrote that in order for Germany to succeed, she would have to devote herself to the welfare of the continent and not vice versa. With a sacred sense of responsibility for the future of Europe, Germany will incorporate the natural rights of the other peoples into her own political ambitions and hold a protective, not ruling hand over them. And in her military protection is a better guarantee for perpetuating their sovereign culture than our anti-German alliances with nations beyond our continent. It maintained that the Reich does not mean domination, but responsibility and a sense of mission, not hegemony, but a unifying inspiration of our clans, particular nations, and ethnically related families. Thus, far-sighted Germans advocated the need for the transition from the German Reich into a European Reich. Franz Six, director of ideological research in the SS, wrote that common racial ancestry, despite political and ideological differences, is the binding element of the European nations. One Dane recalled, "Young people receptive to this biologically based perception correspondingly adjusted their attitude toward foreign peoples. This led to a genuine broadening of the national sense of belonging. It was the starting point for renewing the 1100-year-old idea of a unified Europe. Many such Western Europeans sought an opportunity to help build a better, stronger, and wealthier Europe. With Hitler's approval, the SS established recruiting offices in Oslo, The Hague, and Copenhagen in April and May 1940. Several hundred Norwegian, Danish, and Dutch volunteers signed on for a pre-military training course. Lasting months, the course included weapons firing, sports, German language instruction, and ideological lectures. Conducted in Kärnten, Germany, it also acquainted participants with the indigenous population. Upon conclusion of the course, officers invited the young Europeans to enlist in the SS as Germanic volunteers. Beyond the allure of a unified continent and disenchantment with previous democratic administrations, economic factors contributed to a gradual rapprochement with Germany. Many unemployed Scandinavians and Western Europeans sought work in the Reich. The Germans registered 100,000 Hollanders who migrated and found jobs in Germany. Denmark recorded 147,000 men out of work in the summer of 1940. The unemployment rate was 18%. Germany helped revive industry in Belgium and in the Netherlands by awarding armaments contracts to manufacturing companies there. The cooperative attitude of the workers, many of whose plant managers had fled to Britain, led the Germans to implement measures to improve labor's social conditions. Unemployment in France, the largest foreign producer for the German war industry, dropped to practically nil by 1943. Having grappled with communist trade unions before the war, French industrialists favored collaboration with the Germans. They also recognized that France and her colonies were too small a market for the country's modern, expansive industry, and sought to cultivate European clientele. The NSDAP's foreign policy chief, Alfred Rosenberg, argued in a speech that Europeans could acquiesce to German leadership in continental affairs. A small nation does not relinquish its honor by subordinating itself to a more numerous people in a larger realm. We must acknowledge the laws of life to survive. The facts of life show that there are numerically, geographically, and politically powerful nations and that there are smaller ones. To accept the influence of a realm like that of the Germans, demonstrating its former strength after years of hard trials, is not a sign of weak character or of questionable honor, but a recognition of the laws of life. The German army instructed its soldiers garrisoning conquered countries to assume a firm but cordial posture. Guidelines for soldiers stationed in Denmark stated, "Every German in Denmark must always be conscious that he represents the German Reich and that Germany will be judged by his conduct. When meeting Danes, avoid anything that could insult the Danish national honor. The Danish woman is to be treated respectfully. Avoid political arguments." These circumstances reaped benefits for the Germans. According to a 1947 Gallup poll, 40% of Danes canvassed had been outspokenly sympathetic toward Germany. Just 32% had felt hostile. Later in 1940, the Waffen-SS established its first division incorporating Germanic volunteers. Flemish and Dutch enrolled in the Westland Regiment, while Nordland recruited Norwegians and Danes. Joined by the seasoned VT regiments Germania, these formations merged into the 5th Waffen-SS Division, the Vikings. The roster included 400 Finns, plus smaller contingents from Switzerland and Sweden. Hauser later observed, "They thought beyond the boundaries of their national states towards something greater, a common purpose." A post-war poll of surviving Dutch SS men summarized that the better educated were fascinated by the Reich concept with its prospect of the consolidation of all Germanic peoples. The Israeli historian Zeev Sternhell saw their commitment as proof that there could be a civilization based not on birth or on the privilege of wealth, but on community spirit. They sought new values which could guarantee the state's cohesion, and this disavowal of materialism excited, fulfilled, and influenced the spirit of many Europeans, and not just the least prominent among them. The German cause, groping for acceptance among European populations, gained favor when war broke out with the Soviet Union in June 1941. Hitler authorized a Waffen-SS proposal to establish national legions of volunteers from neighboring states to fight in the East. Opening on June 27th, recruiting offices counted 40,000 applicants the first day. The German security police, the SD, circulated a confidential analysis to leading representatives of the Reich's government and the NSDAP on the reaction in the occupied countries. It reported a direct reversal in attitudes in Germany's favor in Denmark. Prominent people in Danish business life and in the clergy who had up until now been reserved or even hostile toward Germany are changing their position on Germany now that she has begun the battle for European civilization against Soviet Russia. Applications to join the Waffen-SS have markedly increased. One recruit among the 6,000 Danes to serve in the Waffen-SS recalled how many of his countrymen feared that were Germany defeated, Denmark would suffer the same fate as the small Baltic states. Degraded to a Russian military district, politically neutralized, forcible implementation of the communist bureaucratic economic system, gradual Russianization, and deportation of the political and cultural elite, with ruinous consequences for the biological substance of the Danish people. The Danish government founded the Free Corps Danmark, the Denmark Volunteer Corps, on July 3, 1941, which granted authorized absence without forfeiture of seniority or pension to members of the Danish army who transferred to the new formation. Its first commanding officer, Christian Kreising, stated in a national radio speech in July, "Regardless of our political affiliations, we all feel that Bolshevism and its threat to the northern states must be destroyed. I call upon all Danish men capable of bearing arms to take part in this crusade, to secure a rightful place for our fatherland in the reformation of Europe." In Amsterdam, 50,000 people attended an anti-communist rally in support of the German war effort. Regarding Scandinavia, the SD reported, "The German-Russia conflict has turned attitudes in Norway more favorable toward Germany. There are countless volunteers for the SS Nordland Regiment. In Belgium, Flemish nationalist circles are unconditionally on Germany's side in the struggle against Bolshevism. Eventually, over 20,000 Flemish served in the Waffen-SS, many joining to combat the arch-enemy of Christian Europe in the East. The Swiss journalist Armin Moeller wrote, "They came because they hoped for the German Reich to forge a unified Europe of free nations. They wanted neither a commissar state nor a society of everyone competing against one another. There was much idealism then, such as is really only possible among the young." In Paris, French politicians met on July 7th to discuss formation of the Legion of French Volunteers, or the LVF. The resulting fighting force left to deploy against the Soviets in August 1941. Within months, the sponsorship program, Friends of the Legion, gained 1.5 million supporters. The rector of the Catholic University of Paris, Alfred Cardinal Baudelaire, called the volunteers among the best sons of France. They defended not only the honor of their country, he stated, but fight also for the Christian civilization of the continent. This legion is, in fact, in its own way, a new knighthood. These legionnaires are the crusaders of the 20th century. Jacques Benoît Machy, a cabinet minister in the government of unoccupied France, regarded a pan-European war effort against the USSR as the platform upon which provincial patriotism can band together, free from antagonism and traditional rivalries. It is the vehicle to break nationalism's inner conflicts, to develop into a European supranationalism. The threat of Soviet expansion was a genuine concern to Europeans, who were more familiar with the consequences of earlier communist revolutions in Russia, Germany, Hungary, and Spain than were the people of Britain and the United States. German correspondents covering the advance of the fighting forces into Russian territory filled the news media with reports about destitute living conditions among populations under the hammer and sickle, as well as the merciless treatment of political dissidents there. An article published in August 1941 expressed more or less popular views about the Soviet menace. Today, all Europe knows that the war against Bolshevism is Europe's own decisive struggle, the consolidated war of Europe civilization against the powers of destruction and formless chaos. A new, revitalized Europe has learned to grasp what an enormous danger the specter of Bolshevism represents. It is of symbolic significance that the unity of Europe has begun to take place and prove itself in this struggle. We know only too well what this war is about, but only when one sees the reality of the Bolshevik regime face to face. The influence of this system on the individual person and on his life, only then can one comprehend the cruelty, the overall horror of the system. It is a system that combines every element of devastation and absolute ruin of human values and ruin of humanity itself. Bolshevism is not even a political system one can intellectually debate with, but the organized murder of all life, the degradation of the earth and its people, destruction for the sake of destroying. Regardless of their personal attitude toward Germany, the war against the Soviet Union was in part a unifying factor out of necessity to Europeans. French, Walloon, and Spanish volunteers served in the German army, in ethnic regiments commanded by officers of their own nationality. French and Walloon troops eventually transferred to the Waffen-SS. Berger arranged for German drill instructors conducting recruit training to attend special courses to acquaint themselves with the national and religious customs of the inductees in their charge. SS Colonel Richard Schultz recalled, "The instructors needed to summon sympathy and understanding and a well-balanced acceptance of the mentality of various nations." In a September 1941 article, an SS combat correspondent described the odyssey of foreign volunteers serving in the Viking Division. "They came to us misunderstood by their countrymen, not in proud columns, but individually, resolute and clear-minded, often against father, mother, and family. They are not strangers here, but through their blood and their deeds, they have found in their regiments honor, a rightful place, and a home." Germanic volunteers often experience isolation from their countrymen, thanks to lingering ambivalence among the populations of occupied lands toward Germany. Traditional international rivalries of saturation of anti-German publicity in the pre-war democratic press, suspicion of Hitler's motives, and the German invasion of 1940 all retarded appeals for European unity. Another obstacle to cooperation and goodwill, ironically, sprung from the Reich itself. Powerful and numerous, it was unavoidable that the Germans could exercise great influence over European affairs. Prominent nationalists in the country believed that this entitled them to subordinate their interests of neighboring states to those of Germany. In June 1940, the German government introduced proposals to restructure European commerce. Addressing members of the Planning Committee, Funk offered this guideline: Germany now possesses the power in Europe to implement a reorganization of the economy according to her requirements. The political will to use this power is on hand. It therefore follows that the countries must fall in line behind us. The economy of other European lands must suit our needs. Foreign observers heard Funk state in a speech in July, future peacetime commerce must guarantee the Greater German Reich a maximum of economic security and the German people a maximum of consumer good to elevate the national economy. European trade is to be aligned with this goal. Based on a 1939 study by the Prussian jurist Carl Schmitt, National Socialist officials proposed granting sovereignty only to countries populated by ethnically worthwhile peoples. The German Commissioner for Occupied Holland, Seyss-Inquart, championed similar views. Party zealots considered him a better choice for foreign minister than the pragmatic, more constructive Ribbentrop. In his essay, The European Order, Seyss-Inquart wrote of a natural ranking in which every nation has a place in the community according to its economic capabilities, its biological vitality, its martial strength, and cultural value. He called upon Europeans to acknowledge the Reich as the principal power through which their own strength can best be realized. He added that Germany, through superior achievement, is accorded higher responsibility for all who comprise European civilization, which was formed by the industriousness of the Nordic race. Such one-sided proposals regarding post-war Europe dismayed Ribbentrop. He warned in a memo that Germany's allies feared that after the war, Berlin will place a German governor in every country. Neutrals, he wrote, are concerned that Germany plans to annex them. The notion of ranking European peoples according to their value, racial or ethnic heritage among the criteria threatened to create the divisions Hitler had previously sought to avoid in Germany proper when combating the party's race theorists. In the occupied countries, attitudes of German superiority were often apparent at lower administration levels. Lvov, for example, was a Polish-Ukrainian city the German army wrestled from the Soviets in June 1941. It subsequently came under the Reich civil jurisdiction. An ethnic German resident there recalled, the passenger compartments of the streetcars were divided in the middle by wide leather tubing. A sign in the front section read, only for Germans and their allies, Italians, Hungarians, Slavics, and Romanians. It was shameful to see how many people were crowded together in the rear section, while up front sat perhaps 2 people and 1 or 2 policemen stood on the platform or beside the engineer. Though Hitler had decided to gradually release all Polish prisoners of war, German authorities discouraged fraternization. In a 1939 assessment, the SD faulted members of the armed forces for their great broad-mindedness and sympathy toward the Poles, especially former Austrian officers for their respectful attitude. The German military command then ordered the Poles clear the sidewalk for German soldiers and remove their hats when passing officers. However, few occupational troops enforced this tactless regulation. In the West, Hitler detained 65,000 Walloon prisoners of war, while sending all Flemish captives home. Germany continued to hold 1.5 million French soldiers prisoner. The war demanded that the Germans abandon such counterproductive policies. The Reich's disorganized armaments industry experienced a decline in weapons manufacturing during 1941. Production of howitzers, artillery rounds, and small arms ammunition substantially dropped between February and December. The factories could not keep pace with the quantity of ordnance being lost in the Russian campaign. As the Red Army retreated in the east, the Soviets dismantled and evacuated 1,360 industrial plants. Their demolition squads destroyed remaining facilities, including 95% of the Ukraine's power works, plus granaries, warehouses, refineries, bridges, and machinery. The Germans were able to partially restore the economy at considerable cost, investing far more in reconstruction than they were able to reap in raw materials and surplus grain. These circumstances placed an enormous burden on German resources. There were 7.5 million foreign workers in the Reich by September 1944. These included prisoners of war, the voluntarily recruited, and eventually those impressed into the workforce. Northern and Western Europeans received the same pay, vacation time, and health care benefits as German labor. Eastern Europeans suffered poor treatment. Fritz Sauckel, in charge of mobilizing labor, stated in December 1942 that whipped, undernourished, and cowed Eastern workers will more burden the German economy than be of use to it. A decree enacted by Himmler that month made abuse of foreign laborers by Germans a punishable offense. Only as the military situation worsened did conditions for Russian and Ukraine workers improve. Poles fared better, largely due to the value of Polish industry for the war economy. Decent treatment of foreign labor plus the reorganization of the entire armaments industry by civil officials led to a dramatic improvement in output. Between December 1941 and June 1944, armaments manufacture increased 230%, though the workforce was augmented by just 28%. In 1944 alone, German industry produced enough ordnance to fully equip 225 infantry and 45 panzer divisions. German factories accounted for 88% of arms production. Foreign contracts for the balance. A unified Europe based on goodwill and equal status for all countries was now a necessity. Hitler harbored reservations about restructuring Europe with all nations on equal footing. He mistrusted his allies. German intelligence reported that after German defeats in 1943, Romania, Hungary, Finland, and Bulgaria discreetly contacted London and Washington about concluding a separate peace. The Allies informed them that the USSR must be involved in the negotiations, leading Germany's satellites to drop the initiative. The Fuhrer was no less wary of Philippe Pétain, president of unoccupied Vichy France, who proved unsympathetic to the German cause. Hitler limited the roster of the Legion of French volunteers to 15,000 men, even though there was available manpower to quadruple the number. The contemporary historian Franz Seidler pointed out Hitler feared losing his freedom to make decisions about regulating post-war Europe if he accepted foreign help. When the Walloon Legion officer de Grelle addressed Belgian workers in the Berlin Sportspalast in January 1943, he received acclaim from his audience, a total press blackout in the German media. Recognizing German policy as an obstruction to the rapprochement supported by many of his countrymen, the French politician Laval told Hitler, "You want to win the war to create Europe. You must create Europe to win the war." At the time of de Grelle's Berlin speech, the German armed forces and their allies were already losing ground in the war of attrition against Russia, Britain, and the United States. More Germans saw the need for foreign assistance. This required rethinking the Reich's continental attitude. In February 1943, the foreign policy advisor Dr. Kolb introduced proposals for multilateral cooperation. He recommended that treaties be concluded upon the basis of absolute equality of the signatories. A nation should enjoy parity in the European community regardless of its form of government. Kolb's plan required Germany to relinquish hegemony over the continent. In September 1943, Arnold Koester, head of the Planning Commission of the Armaments Ministry, bluntly stated in a memorandum that the Reich conducts an improvised exploitation of the occupied territories. The result was resentment amongst society's elements of goodwill, mounting hatred among hostile strata of the population, passive resistance, and sabotage. The German diplomat Cecil von Rintfink reported to Ribbentrop on September 9, "It is obvious that the mood in Europe has been worse for some time and that resistance movements are growing rapidly. This development can have dire consequences for the willingness of the European nations to commit their resources for our victory and must be countered." Rintfink considered one of the worst shortcomings to be the fact that, apart from what is occasionally stated about the economic field, we have so far avoided saying anything more concrete about our intentions. This gives the impression that we want to keep our hands free to implement our own political plans after the war. Attending a wartime lecture on the danger of communism, de Grelle voiced pan-European concerns when he told the speaker that the volunteers understand what they are fighting against, but not what they are fighting for. German occupational policy in former Soviet territory was counterproductive. Aware of the threat that Eastern populations such as the Mongols had historically posed, Hitler preferred to keep them politically impotent. He stated during a military conference in June 1943, "I cannot set any future objective that would establish independent states here, autonomous states." He privately remarked in April 1942, "To master the peoples east of the Reich whom we have conquered, the guiding principle must be to accommodate their wishes for individual freedom as far as possible. Avoid any organized state form in this way. Hold the members of these nationalities to as limited as a standard of civilization as possible." The Völkischer Beobachter mirrored this contempt for Russians as in the following description of a group of Soviet prisoners published in the July 1942 edition. "We all know him from the newsreels, this earth-colored, leathery face with the apathetic, furtive, animal gaze and the wearied, mechanical motions, this gray, monotonous, nameless mass, this herd in the truest sense of the word." Thousands of Russians deserted to the invaders, often giving the reason that Stalin had executed someone in their family. In July 1941, out of 12,000 members of the Soviet 229th Rifle Division, 8,000 jumped ship. In September, 11,000 men belonging to the 255th, 270th, and 275th Rifle Divisions went over the hill as well. Desertions continued to plague the Red Army. In May 1942 alone, 10,962 Soviet soldiers crossed over to the Germans. Another 9,136 followed in June, then 5,453 in July. The Germans counted 15,011 Red Army deserters in August. In May 1943, 90 Russian battalions, 140 independent rifle companies, 90 battalions consisting of non-Russian troops such as Georgians and Tatars, plus over 400,000 unarmed auxiliaries served in the German armed forces. A Cossack division and several regiments supplemented this military force. At least 500,000 former Soviets fought on the German side that year, and Cossacks were especially effective in combating communist partisans. Hitler was initially shocked by the number of Russian units in German army service, and in February 1942 forbade more to be established. He soon gave up his resistance to the practice thanks to the achievements of these formations. Since the beginning of the Soviet-German War, captured Russian officers repeatedly advised the invaders that the establishment and formal recognition of a Russian national state with its own army of liberation was essential to overthrow the Stalin regime. Officers testifying included former commanders of the 3rd Guards Army, the 5th, 12th, 19th, and 22nd Armies, and more than a dozen other generals. The German diplomat Hilger interviewed 3 prominent Russian prisoners on August 1942. Vlasov himself told Hilger, "Soviet government propaganda has managed to persuade every Russian that Germany wants to destroy Russia's existence as an independent state. The Russian people's resistance can only be broken if they are shown that Germany pursues no such objective, but is moreover willing to guarantee Russia and Ukraine an independent existence." Hitler recorded Colonel Soyetsky as stating, "Stalin, because of his continuous defeats he is considerably responsible for, has lost all his popularity in the army. The Soviet regime has always been hated by the broad mass of the population." Soyetsky also opined that publicly defining German war aims favorable to Russia would lead to the immediate collapse of Red Army and national resistance. At this stage, Hitler, his influential Chancery Director Martin Bormann, and Reichs Commissioner for the Ukraine Erich Koch opposed post-war Russian autonomy. Italian Marshal Giovanni Messi observed, "Germany has not understood how to awaken the sympathy and willingness to cooperate among the populations of the occupied territories." Hitler's mistrust of Germany's treaty partners and of the Eastern peoples obstructed a rational European policy. Throughout most of the war, German propaganda vilified the governments of enemy countries while describing their civilian populations and military personnel as decent but duped by unscrupulous leaders. The Reich's media revised this prudential practice with respect to the war in the East. When the Germans invaded, the Soviet secret police, the GPU, liquidated political prisoners in eastern Poland and in the Baltic states. The Germans discovered over 4,000 victims in Lvov, in Luck 1,500, and in Dubno 500. Summarizing the German official inquiry, Dr. Philip Schneider wrote, "Without any doubt, those murdered were tortured before their death in a sadistic way. Torture chambers built especially for the purpose were used." Along repeat routes, the GPU and the Red Army strew mutilated bodies of German prisoners shot or tortured to death. The purpose was to provoke reprisals against surrendering Russians by the invaders, thereby deterring desertion. In the Tarnopol jail, German troops found one of their missing bomber crews with eyes gouged out, tongues, ears, and noses cut off, and the skin on the hands and feet peeled away. This was a favorite GPU torment accomplished by first immersing the appendages in boiling water. During January 1942, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet landed Russian mariners along the German-occupied section of the Crimean coast near Odessa. An engineer with the German infantry division there recalled this many houses along the beach had served as hospitals or as collection areas for the wounded. The Russians entered, killed the orderlies and the physicians, and raped the nurses and female assistants. Then they threw the women into the ice-cold water of the harbor basin. They shot the wounded and sick soldiers or dragged them into the street and poured cold water over them so that they would freeze to death in the outdoors. The German press described GPU agents and Soviet soldiers committing atrocities as the Untermenschen. The expression literally translates as lowly persons, but historians sometimes interpret it as meaning subhuman or racially inferior. It in fact refers to the depravity of the individual mind and spirit, the triumph of corruption over the refined qualities of civilized man. Beyond the Soviet troops, Stalin's enforcers, and rank-and-file Russian communists, the word more or less became associated with the Eastern peoples in general. Melita Weiderman, editor of the diplomatic journal Die Action, expressed the frustration over German propaganda and foreign policy felt among prominent citizens. In 1943, she wrote to several SS leaders advocating the pan-European idea and a revision of German practices in the East. She directed a letter to Himmler via his advisor on October 5th, in which she maintained, "Our silence over the future form of the new Europe is considered in the occupied territories and among those who are officially our friends to be absolute proof of our wicked intentions." Weidmann added, "First the Jews were declared the Untermenschen and deprived of their rights. Then the Poles joined them. Then the Russians and very nearly the Norwegians as well. Who's protecting any nationality from being relegated to the realm of Untermenschen by Germany and then destroyed?" She continued, "Our Untermensch slogan has helped Stalin proclaim a national war. The entire Russian farming community, most of the intelligentsia, and the senior leadership of the Red Army are enemies of Bolshevism and especially of Stalin. Our policy confronts these people with a tragic dilemma: either fight for Stalin or abandon their people, surely among the most talented of the white race, to the fate of a destitute, looted colonial territory." The German army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the 6-month Battle of Stalingrad, which ended in February 1943. This forced many Germans to the conclusion that without active foreign help, the war would be lost, which required a fundamentally new approach to the Reich's administration in Europe. To implement such a revision, resisted by the highest state leadership, advocates needed a vehicle, an organized bloc. They found it in the Waffen-SS. Early in the war against Russia, Hitler spoke of the need for Europeans to overcome nationalist proclivities. The threat from the East alone, with the danger of reducing everyone to the Bolshevik Asiatic plane, which would mean the destruction of all basis of European civilization, compels us to unify. A prominent journalist and former Waffen-SS lieutenant, Hans Schwarz von Berg, wrote later, "The old points of departure of German policy were too provincial to realize the European revival and a voluntary spirit of freedom, so passionately striven for by activist, optimistic younger elements. Only the foreign units with their clear-cut European will, anchored in the perception of the SS as the European fighting elite, changed this. This war's fury demanded more than hired mercenaries. It demanded constructive common goals and binding idealistic motives of the fighters. Germanic volunteers in the Reich service did not consider themselves to be in a subordinate role. We fought neither for Germany nor for Hitler, but for a much greater idea, the creation of a United States of Europe," wrote de Grauw. "We were all unified by the same will. Honorably represent our nation among the 30 that came to fight. Do our duty since we fought for Europe. Gain an honorable place for our fatherland in the continental community that would evolve from the war. And finally, create combat units whose value guaranteed achieving social justice when we ultimately returned home after the end of hostilities." The Swiss SS man Heinrich Bühler recalled, "Regarding the restructuring of Europe after the war, there was no program. This question was nevertheless often discussed in the Waffen-SS. We were certain that the struggle against Asiatic Bolshevism and the camaraderie joining Germanics and Europeans will lead to reforming Europe in the same spirit." The Swiss journalist Francois Lobziger considered the men political soldiers in the loftiest sense, fighting to achieve a strong, unified, and brotherly Europe. The historian Lothar Grail summarized, "With the beginning of the Russian campaign, a decisive mental awareness developed within the Waffen-SS. The fight for freedom for the realm of all Germans became a struggle for the freedom of the European family of nations. The common cause of volunteers from throughout Europe reinforced this deal. The French historian Henri Lendemar concluded that within the Waffen-SS, the Reich is no longer Germany, but Europe." Himmler, primarily involved in law enforcement, intelligence gathering, and counter-espionage, initially envisioned a post-war Europe with Germany dominant. He harbored a colonial attitude toward the East, influenced not only by the deteriorating military situation, but by many letters he received from the soldiers of the Waffen-SS. He gradually abandoned this imperialistic viewpoint. In a 1943 speech to NSDAP officials in Posen, he described the brotherhood in arms of the Viking division in which Germans and non-Germans served together as the basis for Greater Germanic Reich to come. When a local party functionary refused to approve the application for marriage of a Germanic volunteer to a German woman, Himmler reacted sharply. On October 4, 1943, he sent a letter to Bormann arguing, if on one hand the Reichsführer SS, Himmler's title, is supposed to recruit Flemish, Dutch, and other Germanics to fight and die, and in return declare that they have equal rights, then marriage to the sisters and daughters of these Germanics or of a German maiden to a member of these Germanic peoples cannot be forbidden. Demanding that the NSDAP's Racial Policy Office be deprived of the authority to license marriages, Himmler added, it makes no sense for me to try for years under difficult circumstances to animate a Germanic idea and win people for it, while other offices in Germany thoughtlessly and categorically make it all for nothing. Despite the authority of his office, Himmler was navigating precarious waters. He advocated a European Commonwealth, challenging official Germany First programs and NSDAP dogma. He became the most demonstrative critic of this policy and tacitly the most significant enemy of all supporters and defenders of this policy, stated Schwarz van Bert. Himmler began gaining the upper hand early in 1943. In February, the Reichschancellery granted him supervision over all mutual ethnic German affairs. In the occupied countries, German officials could no longer act on related issues unless in agreement with the Reichsführer SS. The historian Seidler observed, to shape the New World Order in Europe after the war, the SS had an optimal starting position in competition with organs of the NSDAP. The SS planned to establish a European Union with close economic cooperation and a universal currency system without German domination. The loyalty of the foreign SS men gave Himmler more weight in opposing official German policy. These men were not in the slightest degree of a subservient nature, wrote Schwarz van Bert. Eventually, non-Germans became the majority in half of the SS combat divisions in active service. The Waffen-SS took control of all foreign legions serving in the German army in 1944, except for Cossacks. This was an important step in supplanting the concept of national armies with that of a multinational fighting force defending common interests, a force whose veterans could maintain a camaraderie descending customary European rivalries after the war. The Waffen-SS actively promoted establishment of a Russian army of liberation. After meeting with Vlasov, Himmler approved not only the formation of the army but the founding of an exiled Russian government. Vlasov stated that he found greater understanding for his proposals during negotiations with the SS than with the German army. He ultimately received the green light to establish the Russian Army of Liberation, which deployed toward the end of the war. Estonians and Latvians became the vanguards of Eastern peoples donning the uniform of the Waffen-SS. Not without reservations, Himmler eventually acquiesced to Berger's appeal to enroll Ukrainians. Formation of the 14th SS Grenadier Division, together with Yugoslavian continents, ultimately broke down the Slav skepticism that had infected the Reichsführer SS, no less than NSDAP doctrinaires. The diplomat Rentefink wrote, the Estonian SS has proven itself in action against the Bolsheviks, and these developments appear to be taking place with the Führer's approval. The former director of the Bad Tolls Officers Academy noted, the NS racial concept became less plausible after the forming of Slavic divisions. It gave way to the unifying elements of anti-communism, especially welding together the Eastern and Western SS. The example of the Waffen-SS encouraged others in Germany opposed to national policies detrimental to a community of nations. In February 1944, the German commissioner in the Crimea, Alfred Frauenfeld, sent Berlin a 37-page memorandum describing National Socialist Eastern policy as a masterpiece of poor management. That June, the economist Walter Labs submitted proposals for administrative reform in occupied Russia. He asked, are the Eastern territories and populations residing in them to be accepted as members of the European realm, or are they simply colonies and colonial peoples to be exploited? Labs demanded they be according the right to private property, advanced education, and opportunities to realize prosperity. He bluntly pointed out that nations which achieve as much in wartime as what the Red Army has demonstrated are too advanced to accept being reduced to the standards of a colonial people. For its part, the German army issued lengthy guidelines to its troops in Russia in 1943, ordering them to be fair. The Russian hates nothing more than injustice. The Russian is an especially hard worker. If he is treated decently, he works hard. He is intelligent and learns easily. Nearly 2 years earlier, the Waffen-SS had already instructed its members to sincerely try to gain a fundamental understanding of the contemporary Russian psyche. Every SS man being not just a soldier but a bit of a politician. The purpose stated in a directive for soldiers was one of the most important tasks for the German people, namely to win these populations for the European family of nations. They defended the Maas River position on the Eastern Front until April 1942, when it received transfer orders. A grenadier recalled, "During our withdrawal from Taganrog, thousands of residents stood along the road and waved to the units as they drove away, an example of how good the relationship between an SS division and the Russian civil population could become." Though better known for its reputation as an elite fighting troop, the Waffen-SS was no less resolute in advancing social and political reforms necessary for Europe to recover supremacy and renown in world affairs. In combating both the lingering 19th century nationalism dividing the continent and the unproductive dogma of the Racial Policy Office within Germany, the Waffen-SS trod a solitary path. Few among the Reich's hierarchy risked contradicting the NSDAP's legislated programs. Albert Frey, regimental commander, recalled that during the war, in no other realm of the NS state were the flawed political and military decisions of the senior leadership so openly discussed and criticized as within the Waffen-SS. Induction into the Waffen-SS of non-German volunteers forced the Reich's government to recognize the contribution of foreign peoples to the war effort. Germanic recruits demanded a post-war European federation in place of German hegemony. They found political expression through the SS, steadily leading the German government toward a balanced perspective. This augmented the influence of the underrepresented strata that did the fighting, much in the sense that the wars of liberation in 1813 began shifting power from the imperial dynasty to the Prussian peasant militia. Thousands of Ukrainians volunteered to serve in the Waffen-SS. The Ukrainian 14th SS Grenadier Division, which the Germans decided to establish in April 1943, went into action the following year. When Hitler learned of its existence, he questioned its dependability, suggesting it would be better to give its weapons to a new German division. Hearing of General Vlasov's wish to lead an army of liberation, Hitler retorted, "I'll never form a Russian army. That's a specter of the First Order." When SS Colonel Gunther Delkin criticized the official attitude degrading the Russians, Himmler expressly warned him against the SS taking any course of action contrary to the Führer's wishes. Yet the Waffen-SS prevailed. Again citing Schwarz von Berg, in Himmler those demanding that the narrowly defined racial policy be abolished in favor of a broader, more rational interpretation found the strongest voice. And now, the same Hitler, who is in his own domain, once established the most stringent racial criteria, became the advocate of a liberal understanding of the rights of nationalities and races. Hitler disapproved of the revisions doggedly promoted by the Waffen-SS, yet ironically he had created the system that enabled them to progress. In a 1937 speech at Volgasang, he had once stated, "From our ranks the most capable can reach the loftiest positions without respect to origin and birth. What they've been, what their parents do, who their mother was, mean nothing. If they're capable, the way stands clear. They just have to accept responsibility, that is, have it in them to lead." Hitler's policy resembled the spirit of 18th century liberalism in France, in which talented individuals realized their potential and rose to positions of leadership. Since its establishment in 1934, the VT, the future Waffen-SS, attracted men from the untapped wellspring of superior human resources once identified by Guineau. Frey, among the first to join the armed SS, wrote that regarding fellow recruits in training at the Ellwangen barracks, most were farmlands and came from villages. In the German army, 49% of the officer corps hailed from military families. In the VT, the figure was 5%. Just 2% of army officers had rural backgrounds, but a substantial percentage of VT officers grew up on farms. Despite their comparatively limited education, SS officers enrolled in Army General Staff courses consistently scored in the upper 10% of graduates. In some German provinces, nearly a third of the farmlads applied to enlist in the VT. Like the German army, this novel fighting force encouraged battlefield initiative at junior command levels. However, it also relaxed social barriers between officers and subordinates, based authority on winning the men's respect rather than on rank, and instilled a liberal attitude that enabled Germans and other Europeans to stand together as brethren. In a few short years, the Waffen-SS contributed to political and military evolutions that might otherwise have taken decades, and without the patronage of the men's respective governments or populations. In its final form, the Waffen-SS bore little resemblance to the party's showpiece Guard troop, personifying the flower of German manhood that Hitler originally intended for domestic missions at his discretion. Himmler ultimately acknowledged that the Waffen-SS is beginning to lead a life of its own. Not constrained by established military convention, the men of the Waffen-SS approached their craft with a spirit of independence and innovation. Through their voluntary commitment and wartime sacrifices, they lobbied for political reform, customarily forbidden waters for the armed forces, and yet its members hailed largely from a stratum historically lacking public influence. Despite the dynamics, boldness, and aplomb of the Waffen-SS, it never would have gained leverage without a state system in place that fostered discovery of latent ability. The Fuhrer approved expansion of the Waffen-SS despite its defiance. Hitler was a man who sought not to control the people, but to guide them, to help them explore, discover, and harness their potential, even when the changes they introduced contradicted his personal beliefs.